do a quick Q&A in a moment. So a few things I took from that is culture is top down, but it can also be bottom up. We do rely on principal contractors and principal designers to start to change their culture in terms of passing along or passing down risk. Interestingly, competency is not just about saying you are competent through time served experience. What's going to start to come through is that we have to show we're competent through evidencing competence, through evidencing skills and knowledge that we have amassed individually or as companies through some form of competency passport or pathway. And competency is an interesting thing because, and just picking up on Chandru's analogies of driving ridiculously fast through on the motorways of southwest France. Just because you have a driving licence doesn't necessarily make you competent to drive, as Steve and I found out yesterday evening on the M40 when a young gentleman on his mobile phone nearly destroyed the new ASFP Land Rover before it even had time to present itself to our members and everybody else. Fortunately, Steve's new LED spotlights eluded the young gentleman to his faults, and I hope his eyesight will eventually correct itself because Steve invested quite heavily in our new spotlights. They're very good, actually. You can all have a look later. So if you're still in the room, can I please invite Mark and Chandru and Richard back onto the stage? We're going to do a quick Q&A session, hopefully for the last half an hour. Just because you don't ask questions doesn't mean you're going to get out of the room any quicker for lunch. We'll keep you here until the caterers tell us that lunch is ready. Could I ask that Richard and Chandru, are you able to come back onto the stage? If you're not mic'd up, don't worry, because I think there's a very nice Aviva mic. And my esteemed colleagues, Tony and Richard, have got the microphone balls. Now, Tony, being an Everton fan, is not very familiar with a ball. And me being a Villa fan is even less familiar. So what we'll do is I'll sort of stand here and look for hands. If you can put your hand up, you would be passed in hopefully the most health and safety appropriate way the ball. There's a gentleman at the very back with his hand up, right up by the rear screen, Richard. So it might be worth just a quick jog up the stairs, Tony. Give us a quick sound check.
I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
There you go.
Okay, I've got a few questions.
Your question. A few questions. Okay. We'll do one at a time and we'll answer them after each one.
I think there might be short answers.
Excellent.
There's one which is the accountable person versus the responsible person under the Regulatory Reform Order 2005. Is the accountable person displacing that duty holder under the Regulatory Reform Order 2005? Okay.
Richard, you talked about the most competent person in the room being seen as the person with responsibility. So to that question, I'm going to divest myself of being the most competent person in the room. Who would like to pick that one up?
I'm happy to have a go first, and then Chandru can tell me if I've got it right. No, I don't think it does. The responsible person has legally separate obligations and duties to the accountable person. They might be the same person in practice, but the legal duties remain separate, and there's no check that, I think the Fire Safety Act has recently been kind of clarified to be more explicit about certain aspects of where those duties apply to the responsible person, but there's no amendment to those limits of responsibility. The accountable person role is new and additional. Sorry. Yeah, I think that's
so.
about
I'm
right.
advising a client on the need for the responsible person under the 2005 order. So I'll continue to do so in that case.
Sorry, could you repeat the last of that? I couldn't quite hear.
Yes, I'm advising a client who has quite a large civil engineering contractor employing 1,500 people. They've got quite a number of premises and they haven't got a single responsible person under the Regulatory Reform Order. And I'm advising them present day to implement something So I will continue to do so as I've done before for other clients.
Yeah, so the regulatory reform order applies to a whole range of commercial buildings. The accountable person role applies only to those defined as higher risk buildings.
Okay, I've got another one.
I was just going to add, we had a big debate actually, whether the accountable person should replace the responsible person for those specific buildings. And we purposefully decided not to, because there are different duties exactly as described. And in some cases, it might be right that that's the same person, but in other cases, it's perfectly reasonable and fair for it to be split.
Yeah, I've fed into that debate through one of the channels, one of the institutes.
Could I also just add, I'm really sorry, I've stayed longer than I thought I would. I'm going to have to leave in about 12 minutes. I do apologise.
That's fine. That's fine.
There is another one. The overstretch I see in the built environment of the HSE with regards enforcement of the built environment, particularly the construction phases, it's a concern for a number of us, and it's been a concern for a number of years. And all we see at the front end is a contraction of resource. So with this Building Safety Act now being enforced by the HSE, should I still have those concerns? Because we do have a skills shortage out there, and at the front end, I mean, I've raised concerns a number of times before on quite large value projects, and the HSE backup doesn't seem to be there. It's quite invisible in certain places. So I think this is a brilliant act. The presentations are very informative, and I've learned quite a bit this morning. But it will become a paper tiger if it's going to be enforced by an under-resourced organisation. So what's your view on that? Are we going to see a beefing up of the HSE to go and adopt this, or is it just going to be the paper tiger that it pretty much is right now?
I think that's probably me, isn't it, Richard? I would love to hear your answer on that.
Well, you've now got 10 minutes, Chandru, so it's...
Yeah, so, I'll take up the 10 minutes so that I don't get any other difficult questions. Look, we are funding the HSE quite significantly upfront. It is separate funding to what the HSE have currently. So it's ring-fenced for the building safety regulator. And it's a significant amount of government expenditure. Parliament was very, very clear as the bill went through Parliament that that funding should be ring-fenced. And so it's provided to the way government finance works. HSC funding for what it does in construction work goes through DWP, the Department for Work and Pensions, and then gets passed on to HSE. For the building safety regulator, that funding comes to my Department for Levelling Up, and then gets passed on. So it's separate in the way it's provided from Parliament. It's separate in the way it's accounted to Parliament and how the regulator will need to account from it. Now, does that mean that you will have enough capability and enough skills? No, that doesn't. It just means that there will be sufficient money available for the works to be done and for the regulator to operate effectively. That doesn't solve the problem of whether there's enough capacity out there currently or whether that capacity is skilled enough to achieve the ambition that we have for the regulator. My view on that is it will take time. This is not going to be suddenly you turn the lights on and wow, isn't this wonderful? And that's going to require, again, all of us driving, pushing and encouraging new people to join.
Could I add something? Yeah, so I would just say that for conversations I have, we've had an environment where there has literally been no enforcement. Enforcement has been so infrequent, and that has been a major part of the problems we've had. The HSC, as it becomes the BSR, sees enforcement as not just a natural and normal, but absolutely vital part of day-to-day activity. So I think it will be found to be very much the opposite of a paper tiger. I think that my impression is that the BSR has every intention of being very proactive and will have no qualms whatsoever if it deems necessary in enforcing and taking actions that have been seen far too infrequently over the last 10 or 20 years, really. So I think it's going to be very much the opposite. And I think we should all welcome having a far more proactive regulator. It should actually, I think for everyone in the industry, the weaknesses that exist are driven by the tail of the worst parts of each sector. So they are the bane of people trying to do the right things because they win the work without having the resources, skills, or diligence to do the work properly. So I think we should all be welcoming a much more proactive regulator who is going to actually start driving those bad actors out of each of the various sectors we work in.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your questions. Just a quick question, and it can yes or no. So the HSE and I think it's Customs and Excise, both organisations carry what we call open warrants, don't they? They don't necessarily need to get a warrant to access premises. Is that something that will continue through their activities in terms of this?
Yeah, so there's powers in the Act for them to enter buildings. And
so they can just turn up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I should say that extends to building control bodies as well. So they can also turn up to inspect building control bodies unannounced.
Yeah. So like all of these things, funding is always an issue, resource is always an issue, as most of us actually experience probably in our normal working lives. Thank you for your question, sir, at the back. Thank you. Gentleman at the front has a yellow ball, so I'm assuming you've got a question.
I guess I have, yes.
Excellent.
Mine's in two parts. It's on Gateway 3. How's the regulator going to check to make sure that the building is fit for occupation is one part. The other part is, as the client has a responsibility for making sure the building is compliant. I've recently looked at a building that was handed over to us that had gone through building control, NHBC and employer's agent, and I then had a pre-occupation inspection organised and found a whole load of areas that were non-compliant. So the client's being given the responsibility but is reliant on third parties to actually confirm the building's been completed in accordance with building regulations.
Is that the first part?
That was both parts.
Both
really.
parts.
One
Okay.
is how's the regulator going to check that the building is compliant? Is he reliant on what the client gives him? And the second part is, the client has a responsibility, but is relying on third-party consultants, etc. But I've actually done some checks on one and found actually that there were non-compliance areas.
Right. Anyone who's brave enough to pick that one up?
The regulator will need to answer that question in detail. What we have made really clear is that they have the power to inspect. They have the power to inspect records. They have the power to inspect the building over the duration of when the building is being built as well. So it's not just at the gateway point, I should say. The other bit to bear in mind, they will have their own inspectors. So they will not necessarily be reliant on other third-party bodies to do it. They will have their own inspectors. They also have what's known as a joint regulators team. So this will be a joint team which consists of fire engineers from the fire and rescue services, building control professionals from building control bodies, but they can also draw on structural engineers or whoever else they want to draw on themselves, employ them into the regulator to act on behalf of the regulator in inspecting a building. And so they're not limited as to who they draw on. What I absolutely do not think they will be doing, and I would not expect them to be doing, and we will not allow them to do, is rely on the client's third-party inspection purely as a form of a tick box exercise. Does that answer the question?
It does, yes. I mean, from a client's perspective, though, it is a difficult situation where you are reliant on your employer's agent, your consultant's team, NHBC if it's residential being handed over, and building control. And it's really concerning when you actually then go and check what's been done and find actually there are non-compliant issues.
I think so when I was going through those duties and obligations, that client duty to ensure you've got the right resource and time to do the work properly, that is the trigger for clients to really step up their interrogation of the way that they actually structure their procurement at this stage, because have they actually appointed the consultants to go and do the checking that's needed to have the surety? Have they put the right people in place as part of the design and inspection team during the construction phase, not occupation stage. Have they got their facilities managers and their management teams involved at the briefing stage to get the building right for when they do get to the end period? You know, the safety case is a game changer from my point of view. I think you'd be mad to design a higher risk building and wait till Gateway 3 to write the safety case. I think you need to be writing the safety case as part of the client brief. How's the building going to be operated? How are you going to keep it safe during its lifespan? And then design in accordance with the safety case. So, and then you've got these other drivers that are coming through in terms of the extended time periods for enforcement and prosecution for non-compliance with the building regulations, the Defective Premises Act. The drivers are totally different for the supply chain and for clients as this legislation comes into force. If they don't respond to that, maybe they'll respond when people actually start to get fined and go to jail. But actually, I think there's a real reevaluation process that has to happen inside those client organisations to make sure they're getting what they want. Because just assuming that the way they've always done things is going to work. I mean, as Einstein said, you know, insanity is repeatedly doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome. So why would you expect the procurement and appointments that you've made historically that haven't delivered the quality and compliance that you want to work? So there's a need to change that. You should be involved throughout the process, checking whilst it's being built, not at occupation stage. Yeah, those changes need to happen.
It is a bit strange that as a client, you're suddenly checking the checkers as well, because you're the ones that are actually going to have to stand up and say, yes, it's compliant.
But there's a whole industry reevaluation of how quality control and quality management is delivered that should be driven by this. Because when clients get to Gateway 3 and the regulator won't let them occupy the building, that's going to be very painful.
I think it's going to be a challenge, a real challenge.
Yeah, I'd agree.
I don't think anyone underestimates the challenge, I think. And I will take your Einstein and I will up it with a Shakespeare. On the last page of Hamlet by Shakespeare, there was a word, status quo ante. And for those of you who don't know what that means, it means what was before will never be the same again. And I think you have to put your mindset into that. We changed the phrasing quite a few years ago of if there was going to be a fire in this building to when there is going to be a fire in this building. That's been our thinking for a while. And it does change the mindset. So I appreciate a lot of the questions that are coming today are about problems that are now and how we're going to resolve them in the future. And the Fire Safety Act was ratified a couple of months ago. There's going to be, a 2 or 3 year implementation period as these things ramp up and everybody has to gear themselves towards it. And I think, although we get stuck in the here and the now and we have day-to-day problems, the trick for all of us to do is to invest in the future and actually look at how we then engage with all of those bullet points. And I have to say, Cave Green is very relaxing to look at, Richard. I sort of found myself sort of really immersing myself in that one. But to actually look at saying, well, okay, we have all these day-to-day problems. Steve and I as a management team discuss all of the problems that Cave has. And if you don't think trade associations have problems like commercial businesses do, you're mistaken, because we're closer to commercial businesses than you actually think. So I think it's about actually looking at how we engage with the things we're being talked to about today and actually looking at how we invest in that future. Because if you don't, and if we don't as an industry, and bearing in mind the construction industry is still it's the UK's biggest employer by headcount across the entire set of disciplines. There is not another industry that is as big as the employer as the construction industry. So we have to change. Anyway, I hope you all appreciate status quo ante if you've never heard of it before. Next question. Has anyone got another question? Niall, the esteemed Niall Rowan, ASFP Regulatory Affairs Officer. Have you got to go, Chandru?
I'll listen to Niall's question.
Ah, okay.
If it's tough, I'm out the door.
Kept him in his seat.
If it's an easy one, I'll stay and answer it.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes,
right.
But you can always shout,
The question is for Chandru, and I've been bursting to ask it before he legs it. Right. One of the biggest problems we have in this industry is as a result of poor decisions and poor designs in design and build contracts. A lot of the people in this room are specialist contractors who have to sort out the mess of poor design because design is not solved and done early enough. Right. Dame Judith Hackett in her report said Gateway 2 would be full plans And we interpreted that, and many others, as the end of design and build. And yet when I see in the consultation, the latest consultations on the Building Safety Act, can't see the same bill, there's all reference to design and build statements. So what happened to the requirement for full plans that we hope would come out of Hackett?
Yeah, so it is full plans, and the design and build is not referring to a design and build contract, and the statement is not the statement in and of itself, but it consists of various other elements to it. So it's still there, it's still the full plans, and actually the way the system works, it probably does discourage design and build contracts in the way that the legislation is established and the way the regulator will enforce it. It probably does discourage it, but what it tries to do is ensure that whatever you say you're going to do, right the way from planning process at the planning gateway, gateway 1, is actually followed through right throughout. So the thing I find fascinating, and I should say gateway 2, is you've got to have the full plans, you've got to have it all done up front. You can't sort of then work it
Somebody
through.
writing that down.
I'm hoping.
So the thing I would say is, what I find fascinating is that I talked about the 1,000+ applications at planning stage 1, where 30% of them kept coming back for reconsultation. Right? The industry has not cottoned on to the fact that this regulator, if you go ahead and do what you think you're going to do, when you get to gateway 2, you will start to lose a lot of money because you will not get permission. So you can think about what you want to do at gateway 1. You can pretend you're going to do everything that you're going to do at gateway 2. But if you get to gateway 3 and you have not done what you said you're going to do at gateway 2, your building will remain unoccupied for a long time. That costs money.
Chandru, I was going to say, I've come to the conclusion after our email exchange over the last week or so that design and build thing in the government consultation may be an unfortunate turn of phrase, and it may have us, the construction industry, thinking different things, which is, in many ways is good to know, and it's good to know that we are still sticking with the thing. I was just going to say, do we have a deadline for Gateway 2 and Gateway 3?
We do, but I don't know it off the top of my head. I've been on holiday, come on.
Oh, fair enough.
Because
I've heard
He's been driving in France.
Well, Richard will know, but I've been on holiday and I'm preparing for a new PM, which I've got to go and do now. So if that's okay,
sorry,
I'm going to disappear.
As you de-mic and disappear out the door, I was going to say that we at Nile and I have been talking to a load of Tier 1 contractors, and they know what's coming. They're worried about Gateway 2, that Gateway 2 is going to slow them down, which in many ways is a good thing because they're planning to get. I think they're planning to get it right. I hope they're planning.
Do you want to follow him out?
No, it's all right. All right. Thank you.
Can we just give Chandru a big round of applause for his time? Thank you, Chandru. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. It was well hijacked. For the person that applauded when Niall was talking, I hope Niall's paid you in cash, because the last cheque he wrote me has bounced. So, we've got another question over there in the green. What I would just pick up on Andy's point before we go to that question is for trade associations like us, whose predominant membership is manufacturers and specialist subcontractors, I should have put my other teeth in today, who install passive fire products and systems. What the ASFP is looking to do is engage better and more with the Tier 1s, Tier 2s. We know it's been a bit of a silo thing for us, to the point that at the moment we have Tom Gilbert, who is Head of Fire Safety from Lend-Lease. He's currently sitting as a non-exec on our exec board. The exec board is made up of Steve and myself and our chair and vice chair, and Tom as a non-exec. And we're also currently discussing amongst ourselves how we improve membership value for Tier 1s to join and get involved and engaged with our core membership, as in manufacturers and specialist subcontractor installers. So we are making inroads into closing the gap, the us and them, the cultural sort of passed down responsibility and risk. We're looking at trying to mitigate through better engagement. Right, gentleman with the green ball to my right.
Hi.
Hello.
It seems that there could be very many organisations or individuals that find themselves with a duty to satisfy themselves that the client understands their duties under these new regulations. And some of those organisations could be quite far away from the client.
Do you want to just speak into the ball? Because it has actually got a microphone in it.
Did you get any of that?
There you go. Yeah.
There's going to be lots of individuals and organisations that find themselves with the duty to satisfy themselves that the client understands their duties. And some of those organisations and individuals may be quite far away organisationally from the client. Any views on how those organisations might discharge that responsibility when they're quite far away from the client?
When you say far away from the client, do you mean subcontractors to subcontractors to subcontractors?
Yeah, people
so
far
the
down the supply chain,
effectively.
manufacturers, distributors, potentially doing design activity.
Oh, now there's one.
Subcontractors, that are some way down the contractual organisations.
So I had a conversation with a large distributor of products, and there is a thought that if you give advice to somebody over the counter of your local construction products distributing counter, that could be classed as giving design advice. What's the singular noun for somebody sat on a panel on their own? Richard.
I think a target is the usual.
So, what I was hoping, Dr. Taylor, if you don't mind, can I second you for a second just up here? Because Dr. Taylor, and by the way, everybody, after lunch, we have 2 doctors for your entertainment and knowledge imparting. So anyone with sciatica, corns, or anything else can form an orderly queue. Richard, thoughts?
So I think I kind of think about this as a kind of pyramid, and once the client's appointed the principal designer, the sensible thing to happen in the project supply chain is for the principal designer to basically assure themselves that the client has been informed of and understood their duties, and then you just trickle that assurance down through the supply chain in some form or other. But the critical issue is if you feel you're a designer, you ask the person who's appointed you to provide you with evidence that the client's been informed of and understands their duties. And if they don't, then you've got to think about whether you need to approach them directly. But I think a lot of this will be done in a kind of sensible way. But how will the regulator look at it? I'm kind of hoping that they're going to publish some statutory guidance on what they're expecting to see people to do about this, but they haven't to date. So it's got to be done in a proportionate manner. The HSC, when I speak to the BSR, are clear that they want to, they will target risk and they will act proportionately. That's their intention. But I think it's critical for anyone in that supply chain, until we really know how it works, not to make the wrong assumptions and to seek that clarity. Everyone who subcontracts down to someone else to do design work is going to have to ensure that those people are competent and ask for evidence that they're competent, which will involve an exchange of documents of some form. And I think this is just going to sit as a kind of certificate or a copy of a letter of some form that kind of trickles down through that appointment process. But I don't know, is the simple answer. But the legal expectation is there. Until you get case law, will you actually know how that is going to be enforced? Probably not. So in the interim, act on the precautionary principle, I would suggest.
There has to be a worry within this that is, as Richard says, a lot of this is going to become clear through the courts. And so there is an element of, as you go about your daily life, just ask yourself, how would a man in a white wig look at what I am doing within this, within my role, within the contractual chair? My worry, having been through the government consultations that Chandru mentioned in his, and I'm going to talk a bit about this afternoon, is there are a lot more requirements going to sit within the client. And as the gentleman who was sat just behind me said, how does that get squared away as the sort of the client has these extra responsibilities placed on them? Do they have the competence to actually fulfill their needs and understand what they're getting? And it's only as good as the advice that they're getting is only as good as the people that are giving it to them.
Yeah. So I think some of this is, I've suddenly gone very loud. Some of this has not been tested, and like all of these things, it will appear on statute. Yeah. Lunch I think is at 12:15. Georgina's nodding at me, and she's the boss. So I think we're going to take one more question from the gentleman, Mr. Keeble. Welcome.
Thank you. It's probably almost a statement now because of what's been said before, but you just alluded to it there, Richard, is that there was a line on the screen that's talked about as a specialist contractor, which I represent. You do what you are competent to do. Yet, Richard, you were saying there about the subcontractor who becomes a subcontractor who becomes a subcontractor. We get an awful lot of pressure from the principal, the main contractor, the tier one contractors, to include packages associated with our works within our works. And we push back as much as we possibly can because we are not competent in those parts of the chain, as it were. So I'm presuming, therefore, that under what you're suggesting, we are quite right in pushing it back. We are quite right in saying we are not competent to do that part of it, Mr. Contractor. Back to you to sort out yourself, because you know as well as I do that main contractors are absolutely wonderful at making as little packages as possible so that they've got little management risk and therefore put it down onto the lowly subcontractor.
Yeah. So I would hazard a guess at what you're talking about is possibly you've installed one of your products and you're responsible for mechanical and electrical interfacing of that system, because it is a system that you sell. And the main contractor says you now need to do the fire stopping around your product with the structure that you've interfaced
All
it
the
with.
cabling, containment, wiring that goes with it.
Yeah, so main contractors are very good at creating as few packages as possible to take out cost and lower risk.
And yet at the same time, the main contractors would be if they were here, would be turning around and saying the problem is people don't design our buildings for us properly. All we want to do is build a building.
To the design.
To a design.
Principal designer,
yes.
Principal contractor, yeah. But I do empathise with Mr. Keeble's point that if you're an expert in one thing that interfaces with something else and you're being asked to then extend your works, and I think picking up on what Chandru was saying about at what point do you stop and say that's not us because that is not our primary discipline, and we cannot evidence that we're competent in carrying out those works beyond what we've done.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a characteristic of the industry as a whole in that people are often pushed to do work which is outside the envelope of their normal, not just competence, but normal behaviours or workloads. And I think because there's been no boundary to that, it's got worse and worse over time. These are pretty clear-cut requirements, and you can be held to account against them if you can't evidence how you were competent. So the point at which you start to say, I'm not sure whether we should do this, you're probably way over the line already, because if you're not sure whether you should do it, you definitely don't have evidence to prove that you are.
We're perfectly happy to stand up and be counted for what we're competent to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, but that's absolutely what this is aimed at addressing. It's not a by-blow, it's absolutely explicitly what these requirements are there to do. Like I say, these extended time periods for prosecution for non-compliance mean that the likelihood of these things coming to light is much increased, and the safety regulator, so as the BSR, it'll just look at higher risk buildings directly, but it'll set the same expectations for building control bodies or local authorities certainly taking enforcement action on all types of building work, in my view, in that when they go in to look at a specific default, they will start to look more broadly at whether there are any other breaches as well. And let's get this right. These competence duties are part of the Building Act. They are a requirement of the building regulations in the same way that Part B is.